Yeah, okay. The title is a little bit of bait. Game doesn't need saving. But it's fair to say that the brand new quantum difficulty setting is pivotal for FF14's current and future direction. Yoshida has stated on the record that it's something they're targeting for wider expansion into future content going forward if well received, including new releases like the much anticipated 7.45 variant Criterion Dungeon, whatever they decide to call it. Their vision for the future of FF14 is that whilst they can't just magically churn out more content, what they can do is make sure that each piece is able to be enjoyed by as many subscribers as possible, instead of only being applicable to a very small subset of the community. They want every player to see a piece of raiding content as both accessible and aspirational at once through a scalable difficulty setting that offers meaning to all ends of the spectrum. The final verse, released with patch 7.35, is the very first of those. I have cleared the fight at the highest tier of difficulty, Q40, as well as at the lowest, normal and Q15, and I've spent some time collating my thoughts in this video. Is Quantum the shot in the arm that many hoped it would be, or is it likely to be silently dropped and left firmly by the wayside? Let's talk about it. As a small aside, if you want to support deep dives into FF14 as well as its past, please do consider subscribing, it means a lot to me. So, firstly, what is the Quantum system? In the live letter, it was touted as a scalable difficulty slider going, in the case of the final verse, from somewhere around extreme to comparable to ultimate level mechanics, both in challenge and reward, with it all being based on the same skeleton of one single well-designed fight. The final verse is the last boss of the new deep dungeon, Pilgrim's Traverse, and as a result, instead of using your equipped gear, it instead makes use of your Aetherpool weapon and gear level to dictate your stats in the fight. If you've done the deep dungeon, it's the floor 99 boss, but more complicated. It sits somewhere around the 10-minute mark in length. At least my Q40 clear was something around 9:30 or maybe a little bit more than that, and whilst at lower difficulties it's entirely possible to skip one or two small mechanics, you'll still be experiencing most of it. To tune the difficulty, you need to use offerings. Right now there are 5 types of offering, and aside from bloating your inventory and adding to the clutter, they can be used to scale the challenge of different elements of the battle. They correspond to your foe's max HP, and physical, fire, light, and dark damage, each of which make up a subset of the attacks, mechanics, and damage over times you'll have to deal with. You can input up to 40 at once, 8 of each, though the minimum to score additional rewards is 15. 15 offerings puts you somewhere around an extreme trial, 40 somewhere around ultimate, though there are 4 extra intermediary difficulties in between those. There's also a normal mode too. These offerings are only used when you clear and collect loot, so you're not gonna burn through them on entries and attempts, which is nice. You get 40 offerings, 8 of each, enough for 1 max level Q40 loot redemption from a quest when you first complete Pilgrim's Traverse by reaching floor 100. Other than that, they can drop from things like Accursed Hordes. There's no weekly lockout for the rewards or anything. Instead, this selection of currency is the inhibiting factor. I'll talk more about rewards later, but what I want to do now is discuss the fight. So, the final verse is a 4-man trial style raid that's about 10 minutes long. I first did Q40, the hardest difficulty. The core mechanic of the fight revolves around these 2 debuffs, one of light and one of darkness, which can be changed at will by running into one of the many throbbing veins of that element scattered across the ground. The boss is comprised of 2 parts, the Sin Eater that has been consumed, and the Eminent Grief that makes up the main body. You can only hit the Grief with a light element, and the Sin Eater with Dark Element. Though because you can swap between them at will, this is essentially a mechanic you'll be dealing with the entire time in between the distinct phases that make up the fight. There's a lot of pair stacks, precisely timed debuff trading spreading out, AoE baiting and mob kiting, as well as role-based mechanics that force you to play directly against your natural instincts. Firstly, and importantly, the primary feeling I came out of my clear with is that FF14 actually excels at 4-man content, maybe more so than they do 8-man. Between Criterion Dungeons in Endwalker and this Quantum entry, I genuinely think we've received a slew of some of the most innovative, individually challenging, and outright enjoyable raid content in the game that feels good to beat, loot drops aside. Don't get me wrong, I like Savage and Ultimate raids a lot, but it's clear that the more players are on the field, the more Square Enix have to limit their creativity in lieu of making the fights clearable and fun. The more moving parts, the less personal responsibility they can realistically place on one single player. That's why in World of Warcraft raiding, with their often 20+ player instances, there is a sense of lower responsibility on one individual. In these 4-player battles, they are limited with the number of players on the field, but they are fully free in how they elect to challenge those players, the burden they place on them. The final verse at Q40 is a high-intensity execution and focus check for its entire runtime. There is never really a time where you get to chill in between mechanics. The mechanics themselves are challenging. For example, even the introductory puzzle, which drags players to the middle, forming an ice jail around them, then has them either quickly sprint outside at the right angle before it forms, or remain inside as it pulses, forming into pairs to resolve the light and dark rings surrounding each player. This is simple to do, but it's quick. Quick enough that if you hesitate for even a moment on the pattern where you must escape, you're going to be ping-ponged off the edge of the arena. You're expected to digest the information very quickly, based off of your party's rules, and figure out where to go. Another, later in the fight, has the party juggling this debuff. It stacks up over time, and when it hits 16 stacks, it goes boom. You need to transfer it to another player by having them stand in that explosion, or bad things happen. But to prevent you from focusing fully on this, there are other things going off at the same time. Spreads from plus-shaped explosions, those jails and pairs I talked about just now, chains to break, heavy stack wild charges, and forced colour swaps that the current debuff target has to ignore. To make this more interesting though, the debuff will stack up at different speeds depending on what light or dark element you have at that time. Light, and it'll stack up really quickly, whereas you have dark and it'll instead stack up slowly. You're going to want to carefully manage your colour to make sure the debuffs aren't traded across the entire party too quickly, too slowly, or at an inopportune time during other mechanics. It's a lot to juggle all at once, when you consider that you are also managing your damaging rotation and mitigation on 2 targets at once, ensuring that you're hitting the right foe for your debuff, and changing them as needed to make sure you can output both as much DPS as possible, and keep their health somewhat equalised, as if they get too far apart, they enrage. And you also need to swap to particular colours to fulfill whatever mechanical constraints are going on at that moment. It's a lot, and putting so much on a player in a full party 8-person raid might be too messy to be enjoyable, I think. You have to be paying attention all the time, or things go south very quickly. Speaking of which, the fact that it's a 2-target fight is where a fairly large component of the challenge comes from, and I think it's some of the best iteration of that in the game that actually feels natural. I do have a criticism though. Having multi-target boss fights when the boss is so large and both are essentially in the same location on top of each other with FF14's limited tab targeting is awkward at best, and occasionally downright frustrating at worst. At times, you're pivoting your camera around to try and make sure you can properly tab target to the guy you actually want to hit, and doing that in conjunction with an already demanding encounter whilst also managing your light and dark buffs is certainly adding to the mental load a decent amount. But probably my favourite thing about the final verse is how it manages to deviate away and course correct from one of the most worrying traditions FF14 has fallen to, in my opinion. The thing that always frustrates me about a lot of modern raiding content is that, for the most part, you're going to fulfill the same responsibilities on every role. When you swap from DPS to tank or to healer, there will be a little bit of cooldown management or healing to coordinate and learn, and potentially some boss positioning. But the way you will resolve almost every mechanic is static in the majority of cases, making it an easy swap to go from one to another. This fight has moments that are not like that, with a good example being this little challenge that appears around a third of the way in. In this, healers and DPS are assigned markers that will punish them with a huge pulse of damage and debuffs if they fulfill an illegal action. In the case of DPS, it's using their OGCD abilities, and for healers, it's using direct heals. During all of this, they need to deal with destroying a sequence of towers, healing raid-wides and the following bleeds that apply to players, and avoiding splashing any of their pulses on the tank, who is dealing at the time with their own personal health. They are trapped in a little jail at the front, dealing with fearsome multi-hit bleed busters and line AoEs and towers. There's no major overlap between responsibilities, meaning that each time you come back you are tackling, for all intents and purposes, an entirely new phase. The other reason I love this little and fairly simple phase is a basic one. It forces you to play counterintuitive to your instincts on your role. If you're a healer, you need to stop healing as an instinct and think very carefully about when you're positioned safely to be able to do it. You need to plan in advance even more thoroughly, and there's more of a risk to doing so. As a DPS, you need to carefully manage your rotation without just mindlessly pressing glowies on cooldown, because you run the risk of making your buddies go boom. This extends outside of that phase though. Each role has unique responsibilities that are tested to their limits and essential for success. DPS players have by far the biggest impact on HP balancing between the Sin Eater and the Grief, and need to eye it like a hawk to keep them happily within the safe realm of equalization. Tank mitigation really matters, as busters hit like a truck and are regular enough to deprive you of your defensives quick, and the autos are no joke either. For healers, this is an intense check of your capabilities. Raid-wides are often accompanied by painful bleeds, and the developers seemingly loved to sync those bleeds up with other attacks coming in, sapping away shields right before they're needed. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had to pay special attention constantly, or somebody could drop dead to damage at the drop of a hat. One thing to note here is that Pilgrim's Potions, the ones that you can use in the Deep Dungeon, can also be used here as well, and because we progressed this fight on day 1 and cleared it early on day 2, we didn't have many of them. I think that using these to counteract bleeds and auto attacks will be a resource heavy way of making the healing requirements more easy for players later down the road. But suffice to say, they really push your role to its limits and you feel important for being there. I healed it, and so this is the part of the video where I spend a couple of moments talking specifically about my special interest. One thing I'm a fan of is that this encounter works really hard to provide some level of parity between pure and barrier healers. Traditionally, and I firmly believe this is true in all of the criterions, if you only get to have one healer for difficult content, generally the barrier healer is the play. It provides mitigation and lenience against damage, and just all round makes life easier for the whole party. But in this case, They clearly specifically designed their damage profiles with this in mind. There's a lot of raid wides that only do a moderate initial hit, but follow it up with damage over times that are really heavy, and these damage profiles favour regens and the powerful throughput that pure healers offer, and they also offset their relative lack of mitigation a bit. Shield healers can of course deal with this too, but you won't feel like you're inting by bringing along a white mage, because when you pop down that Liturgy of the Bell, you are literally god for that bleed you placed it down on. They also often have slightly more tools that can deal with persistent tank autos, which the final verse has a lot of. This fight is intense on healing though, it really is. There's basically everything you can ask for. Heavy hits, damage over time, big tank autos and busters. Each of these things weaving and interlinking and overlapping in chaotic ways. There are really cool timing moments that eat your shields right before a hit, so you need to delay your big mitigation until the last moment, and places where you're just going to have to lean on your GCD heals because of the sheer quantity of damage coming out. Honestly, I think of it as the model on which healing damage profiles should be built on. The difference between this and how bored I felt healing raids just as recently as Light Heavyweight and Futures Rewritten are night and day. Really, really good stuff, and I'm so happy to see evolution in that regard. The other thing I love is that there are multiple ways to solve many of the mechanics. Player choice is important, and this fight has it in droves. This leads me on to highlighting what I think is the most interesting mechanic of the entire fight: the men. Late in the fight you'll deal with this. These 5 living flames will spawn and begin to slowly chase the closest target unless you hit them to tether them to you, making them chase you instead. Each of these need to be exploded by walking them into a white puddle, otherwise they'll all explode at the end of the mechanic for unsurvivable damage. Each one gives a short vulnerability, so you need to space them out. But how you go about dealing with each of the 5 is completely up to your choice. You can hit them a few times to break their stone skins and give them a slow. You can walk 2 of them into one another, merging them and making their explosion hit harder, but increasing your time leniency. You can even do 3 if you're a psychopath, but increasing your time leniency. But if you drag them into a dark puddle, they also grow and increase their damage. You have full choice of how you deal with this. Feed 5 one after another with perfect timing. Grow 1, grow 2, slow 1 down. Who will kite what? Who will kite when? Almost anything works as long as you execute it right. Honestly, it's one of my favourite fights in the game. Their combat design is in final form right now if Cruiserweight and the final verse are anything to go by. Mr. Ozma cooked hard. But despite all the good, there are some parts that I find frustrating. A lot of FF14's signature jank is all over this fight. Puddles won't trigger unless you make sure you're smack bang in the middle of them, for example. If you dip your toe inside, sometimes it just won't refresh the timer. Or even if you run all the way in and back out but the server hasn't had time to update it, it might just conveniently forget that you did it in the first place. Things just struggle registering well enough to feel good. Speaking of latency, if you have a lag spike for a moment, this can happen. Really weird interaction, honestly, dragging you to a completely wrong spot on the arena and then ping-ponging you to a wipe. There's also a cost to the Aetherpool system being used instead of traditional gearing, that is, to the customization of spell speed and skill speed. But was it as advertised? Was it a challenging battle with quote-unquote ultimate level mechanics? Well, yes, kind of. What it asks of a player is far and away more than we generally experience from anything Savage has to offer, even fourth turns. I worked harder for this clear than I did for M8S, M4S, or any of the Pandemonium Savage fights in the first day or two, both healing-wise and mechanically. The thing about this fight is that everything it asks you to perform is simple and intuitive. but it stacks you with so much mental load from the quantity of those simple tasks, whilst also needing to worry about damage on the 2 targets and light-dark buff upkeep, that it feels persistently active all the time, with very little breathing room. Now, is it as hard or harder than Ultimates? Well, there's a little more nuance there. Ultimates are very much a consistency check. Most of them clock in at almost 20 minutes long, whilst Quantum is half that at less than 10 minutes. Because of that, it's inevitable that the fight will require less consistency to earn a clear on. For the record, I think this is good. I have long wished for slightly shorter form ultimate level fights that don't feel like a week-long investment for hardcore raiders, or probably months-long investment for those with less spare time. This actually fills that niche perfectly, and I want more, but I do feel that if you place this fight squarely against some of the ultimates as they stand today, especially those affected by previous expansions and passive buffs that jobs have received, this one is far and away more challenging, despite its shorter runtime. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's the hardest fight in the game ever in history. That's certainly a stretch, but it's up there with the toughest fights as they released, for sure, albeit in a slightly more digestible format. It's tough, it's fun, and it feels rewarding to learn. But I did Q15 as well, the lowest difficulty you can make whilst inputting offerings. How does it compare? Do you still get the full experience? Well, I'm pleased to say that they mostly nailed it actually. So, like I said, you can customize your difficulty preference by inserting different types of offerings. You could input 3 of each for your 15, giving a balanced fight. You could instead put in all 8 that scale the boss's health, making the DPS check identical to the ultimate offering, but making its dot damage super low for your healer to have an easy time. You could do the opposite, scaling up darkness damage to test your mitigation in a safe environment. It's really interesting when you consider a player coming in and doing Q15 first, and eventually building their experience all the way up to Q40, and how they can, at each step of their journey, trial themselves and simulate the actual experience of that final tier bit by bit, with the rest being more lenient. I actually think this system is cool as hell through that lens, but I'm not convinced that the fight is different enough to convince players to be motivated to actually journey through that pipeline. I anticipate the more likely outcome is that people will do 1 or 2 difficulties and then drop off and move on. Mechanically, it's 80% the same fight. There are some changes. Instead of your light or dark debuff lasting 60 seconds, requiring constant upkeep and attention, it lasts for 3 minutes. After breaking these chains, the plus-shaped AoEs that require a careful spread and apply a fire dot, they don't exist. During the debuff trading mechanic, the dooms that each player would receive after trading that needed urgent and fast cleansing will have much higher durations, making them more lenient. During the dreaded men mechanic, there will be only 4 and not 5. During the roll mechanic, the DPS don't get their debuffs entirely. It's only the healer who has to deal with any constraints. So, it's mostly the same fight, but with slightly easier timings, less damage, and the knot unfastened on some of the pain points that make it especially intense on execution. It's still a good experience, really, knowing that there are 4 difficulties between them, each of which likely slowly adds back in some of those core components piece by piece, is a fairly exciting concept that seems to be more sustainable for Square Enix than I had initially assumed. It reminds me of the split between normal and savage raids, but this time you get to see all of the steps between and tackle them at your leisure. I do think this fight somewhat falls victim to the hardcore raider paradox though. It's aspirational content and a lot of people enjoy watching it, and they like the idea that it exists in the first place. It has an important position in the game's ecosystem for those reasons, but the number of people that actually engage with it, or even clear it, are going to be relatively low. I have my doubts that Quantum will do much of anything to address that. But despite that, It's good that more players are able to access and find fulfillment from a piece of content, rather than just the very few that tackle Q40. The final verse also suffers heavily from the Criterion debacle. There isn't much reason to repeat the higher challenges. On first clear of Q40, you get a title, and on your first clear of Quantum at any difficulty, you receive another. These both are nice and give you a goal to work towards for your first clear, but the other main drop from any difficulty are the sacks of First Light. These can be opened for a currency that can be traded in for one of the two mounts that released with Deep Dungeon and Quantum. To make that clear, they released for Deep Dungeon and Quantum. In fact, I got a bunch of these sacks of First Light from Deep Dungeon as well. The only exclusive reward for clearing is the title. Everything else is available without entering the content whatsoever. This is a bit of a fumble in my opinion. At least, that's what I would have said if I was trying to spread misinformation. You see, I actually looked a little bit further into it, and these sacks of First Light can drop from Deep Dungeon, yes, and they can also drop from Quantum. But they're time-gated in Deep Dungeon. The way that you obtain the sacks of First Light are for completing the weekly Deep Dungeon challenge logs for completing floor 30 and floor 70 of Pilgrim's Traverse. That will give you a grand total of 5 sacks in total, and that's all you can get for the week unless you do one of two things. You can either do the final verse or the final verse Quantum. Those are the only sources of getting uncapped sacks of First Light whenever you want. The way it works is you use one of these sacks of First Light and then you will get a First Light relic from it. You get between 1 or 2 from every sack. It's RNG. You might get lucky, you might not. And then you can buy one of 3 items. You can either buy the Blue Pixie Parasol, which is a blue variant of the parasol that drops from, I think it's a Cursed Hordes, or you can buy the 2 mounts. The parasol costs 30 and the mounts cost 99 apiece. Now these mounts are probably going to be worth a decent amount of gil. At the moment, at the time of recording, one of them is 30 million gil on the market board and the other one is I think about 24 million gil on the market board, at least on my server. I do have to do my due diligence and make a note that these mounts can drop from the final verse or the final verse Quantum. The reason I actually like this system, and I do think that Quantum has gone at least some of the way to fixing some of the reward issues that I have with things like Criterion, is the fact that, yes, you can essentially get these mounts without ever entering the Quantum. But it's time-gated, and you will be spending anywhere between 2 months or much more in order to obtain one of them. Whereas, should you farm the Deep Dungeon or spend some gil in order to purchase the offerings, you can farm it indefinitely in the final verse or the final verse Quantum. So whilst this system isn't perfect, I would have loved to see some exclusive items specifically from higher difficulties to incentivize players to do those. I don't feel this really does enough to alleviate the issue of not having a reason to repeat higher difficulties in particular, but they have made Quantum itself stand out as a good source of unique rewards. I feel like, to show I've done my due diligence, I do need to mention that those farmable mounts can drop directly from Q40 and Quantum in general, and I would assume that the higher difficulty has a higher drop chance, though that's just a guess from myself, rather than based on any concrete confirmation from Square Enix. Also, I have to vent my largest frustration about the entire system. What on earth were they thinking with the offerings? It's a mess. First of all, is the fact that they take up not 1 but 5 slots in your inventory, which also means after the initial gifted ones, we're going to need to get drops for each of the 5 categories to offer once more. Can't we condense these down into a single item, or better yet, a currency? Isn't that much more user-friendly? Then you can insert them and select which components of the Quantum boss to buff in the exact same way as you do right now, just without any of the meaningless currency bloat. I don't think the current system is preferential to any type of player. More egregious, though, is the way the rewards work. So only one person can insert those offerings into the Quantum, and that person is the only one that receives bonus sacks of light upon completion. The intent is that it means you can go and help others without cost, moving away from the age-old weekly lockout system. But there are better ways to do this. You should be allowing at least one, but as many people can insert offerings as they wish, so there's some level of parity in loot should everyone come packing the goods. This forces you to complete the fight 4 times for the 4 people to feel like they came out of it getting their fair shot. I don't like this at all. You shouldn't feel like you're on the back foot when it comes to receiving drops, like this clear doesn't belong to you. It's absolutely bizarre, and I hope it's swiftly dropped in future iterations. It's also slow as heck to farm more offerings in the first place. On my current luck, after 2 full runs of the Deep Dungeon, it would take me 4 runs to farm enough offerings to run another Q40. And that's if I'm lucky enough to get them cleanly segmented into 5 different types at 8 apiece. So, what do I think of the quantum system? Well, I had a lot of apprehension going into it. Really, it's a bold new direction for FF14 in an attempt to make content deeper and broader, but I wasn't convinced they'd be able to pull it off. Coming out of the final verse, at Q40 it's one of my favourite fights in the game. I'm really impressed. I genuinely think a good job has been done here with the scaling between Q15 and Q40, and that the integrity and overall experience of the fight remains throughout, with just enough different to provide both a learning curve and an aspirational target as you work through the list. The realism behind my hope aside, what I would love to see is this system expanded into a lot more of the game's instanced content, especially in 8-man or less duties, scaling difficulty sliders for Criterion, for dungeons, for trials, even more large-scale duties like Chaotic and even the Forked Tower, player choice, and a direct threadline to improvement in whichever instanced content they so choose. More for both spectrums of the player base to do, as a direct byproduct of their ability to hop in at any ability level. One of the biggest concerns I have about the future of Quantum is, should it be expanded, how on earth you'd keep specific difficulty settings populated. What reason does anybody have to target anything aside from Q15? How do you incentivize the player to want to progress? Do you even need to? These are all valid questions I hope Square Enix are carefully considering, and that their conclusion is informing future design. Let's take Chaotic for example. Very quiet the moment its release patch is over. If Chaotic had the quantum system implemented, how on earth would you make people want to do it after the first month or so? My hope is that in the scaling going forward, we are able to have that difficulty go from normal mode equivalent all the way up as high as they want to go, Savage, Ultimate, to help players break the ice, and maybe find avenues that open up a new interest in raiding for them. Seeing as Square Enix wants more players to delve into this content, it's in their best interests to want that as well. I'm not convinced the vision will become reality, that Yoshida and his team will make it happen. But after completing the final verse, I do see it. And more than seeing it, I'm fully on board. I want it. I hope they can pull it off, and I'm excited to see how they improve it and hopefully expand on it in future patches. I know that from my perspective, for me, if I had this much choice in my challenge, expanded to everything, I'd be playing FF14 a whole lot more. Thank you so much for watching this video if you made it all the way to the end. I really do appreciate it. I have a Patreon, you don't need to support it, but if you do, it'll allow me to keep uploading here more regularly. This video was available early to patrons, and there are updates and exclusive content that go up there regularly. As well as that, you'll be included in the credits of future videos. The people on screen now are the reason I was able to make this one, and I'm greatly appreciative. No pressure though, and of course, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.